All right, we're going to be a moment here, Matthew chapter 12 again, so if you turn there, or you can look up behind me. We looked last time at Jesus' teaching on the abuse of his law. We really encountered sort of Jesus, the lawgiver, coming to this earth and having to make some corrections to all the things that people had misunderstood or misused his commandments and his ways. Even those times when believers are trying to take God's law and in a zeal for trying to be obedient to it, set up their own rules, set up their own fences, their own things to keep them from breaking God's law. And we realize that that's not always bad, but sometimes it can, in fact, replace in our own hearts God's law itself. So we ran out of time to sort of deal with the last portion of that chapter. Before we go into that last portion, I want to read again the first portion, which is in Mark 12, 1 through 8. So if you'd follow me as we read these verses to review just briefly before we get into the other. Okay? Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' He said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for them to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." In a moment we'll read the rest of that, but in our passage right there, what you see is the Pharisees confronting Jesus, confronting his disciples. Very ironic, is it not? Confronting the lawgiver for breaking the law. They have picked up some kernels to eat of the grain as they walked through the fields. And last time we showed that Deuteronomy chapter 23 very specifically said that that was permitted. But what the Pharisees had done with their zeal of trying to keep the Sabbath day was to apply something that was permitted on the Sabbath day, not to be permitted on the Sabbath day, just for fear that you might break it. You might break the Sabbath. And then they begin to apply that to other people, saying, not only are we going to do that, we're applying it to you. And now you're breaking the Sabbath if you're breaking our rule. So the passage shows us something I'm going to suggest is familiar to us. It's familiar because people view others often as guilty of disobedience when they're breaking their particular applications of God's rule, or their own rules, but not God's rule. Rules they fashion themselves and hold other people accountable to. Now, I said last week that there's more to that passage, and we couldn't cover it up. Let me just give you a couple points of review that we wanted to mention. And one of those was simply this, that every aspect of God's law that we encounter has either to do with the love of God and our worship of him. That's the first and greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Or it has something to do with our love of our neighbor and how we do that faithfully. So God's laws themselves, wherever they may be, ultimately return to those two principles. We said that the Sabbath day was one of the favorites of the Pharisees. They just loved to pick this one up and deal with it. Now, when it came to trying to demonstrate their zeal, they had gone overboard on this one. They actually found a way that they calculated 234 different categories of ways that you could break the Sabbath. All right, that's zeal. They're being zealous for trying to be careful not to do that, so they categorized ways that they could break the law. And then they began to judge obedience to the law, not based on what the actual rule of keeping the Sabbath day was, as much as whether they had broken one of those 234 rules. They needed to be reminded that the commandment was originally for man. It was not the man to keep the commandment. That was not simply the way God had designed it. Communion with God and refreshment were God's purpose behind the commandment. But these had gotten lost in the burdensome restrictions that the Pharisees were beginning to impose. Let's now look at beginning at verse 9. What we see is a second confrontation, probably shortly thereafter this one, where the Pharisees have taken their derived laws and applied them again. This takes place in the synagogue, and let me begin reading at verse 9. He, that's Jesus, went on from there and entered their synagogue. And a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more valuable is a man than a sheep? So it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. On the surface, you say, what? A man who just healed a man of his crippled hand, done such a good deed, they conspire to kill him because of it. Why? Because in their hearts they have created a law that Jesus is breaking. The next event that Matthew records is this another Sabbath lesson. The situation is that we have a man with a withered hand. He happens to be sitting in the synagogue, probably come to worship that day. And not surprisingly, you find the Pharisees right there with Jesus as he's teaching, wanting to catch him in some kind of fault that he's made, some kind of trip up that he can do. They're getting even bolder as this conflict between them and him begins to intensify. So as we come to the healing of this man on the Sabbath day, you have to realize that the Pharisees had already made a decision about who this Jesus was. He's the Son of Man. He's calling himself that. They know what that meant. And they have already condemned him. He's a blasphemer in their mind. He claims to have authority to forgive sins. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. Clearly something that couldn't happen if he was the Messiah. Already he has broken their commandments. He's not zealous as we are for the law of God and those kinds of things. They're making their judgment call based on their own rules. They're pretty sure that if this man were present, somebody who needed healed like that was in the synagogue, that Jesus would do it on the Sabbath day. Now, we don't know whether they put this guy in the synagogue or not. It's possible. We don't really know, but it's quite possible that they have placed a man who needed to be healed in the synagogue. And then they will watch what Jesus will do. Ironically, what these Pharisees are doing is believing something about Jesus, that he is an innovator when it comes to the law. He's coming up with all kinds of new things, that he's challenging and undermining the law of God. But what happens is as Jesus speaks and as he acts, he's revealing that in fact they are the ones who've deviated from the law. They are the innovators with coming up with new things. He didn't come to abolish the law. He came to fulfill the law. And that's really important to think about. What is he doing here? He's not simply avoiding doing something that you shouldn't do. He's actually doing something positive, fulfilling the law. He's not destroying the original law. Rather, the original lawgiver is bringing about, he's overruling, he's expounding upon what is the true law and showing how we can keep the Sabbath faithfully. He's faithfully keeping the positive aspect. You think about it, a lot of the commandments are, thou shalt not. Don't do this. One of the things that is helpful in our catechisms and our study throughout the many different generations is people have realized that there are positive aspects that replace the negative aspects. Don't do this. And that's because this is important, that you be doing these things positively. And Jesus is now fulfilling some of those positive aspects of the law right in front of the Pharisees. He didn't campaign for a relaxing of their Pharisaic regulations. He's actually making it clear that they have missed the mark altogether. They've missed the mark. He's showing them the purpose of the Sabbath day. It's what they had missed. And so Jesus teaches them by demonstration. One of the things teachers do, I was a teacher for a number of years before I went into seminary, is that you ask questions to try to help draw out the point you're making. So Jesus does that with this situation. He acts out one of the day's purpose. He tells this man who's sitting in the synagogue to stand up in front of everybody. Now, if you have a disability or something that's kind of awkward, You don't want to be the one that everybody's staring at. But Jesus asks this gentleman to stand and be in front of everyone, presumably so it's not a trick. They can all see exactly what's actually happening to this man. He then says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Here's a man with a crippled hand. Jesus says, "Stretch it out." What he's doing is actually acting out an act of mercy as part of what the day is about, what the Sabbath day is about. In love of God, we said, and in love for his fellow man, he's showing what the meaning of this day is about. Now, if anyone else had asked this man to stretch out his hand, that would have been the most cruel thing you could do. Bring him up in front of everybody and tell him what you can't do. Right? Stretch out that crippled hand. But you can't. He can't do that. That is, of course, if anybody else asks. But Jesus is the lawgiver. He's the king. He is the creator. He is the one who rules over nature. He is the one who can forgive sins. This is the Lord of the Sabbath day. He not only commands obedience, get this, he not only commands obedience, he enables obedience. Okay? Now, once again, the rabbinic laws stated that a physician was only allowed to heal a man on the Sabbath if it were an extreme case, if he was going to die. And he had to be a Jew in order for that to happen. But remember that Jesus wants these teachers of the law to know the true purpose of the law, the Sabbath day. And so for Jesus, if he had just left this man in his condition, in an impaired state, would be, in a sense, to allow his life to continue toward destruction. And he had come to save. That's what Jesus had come to do, to redeem, to restore. And their law was keeping that from happening. Do you see that? You may not heal on the Sabbath day. Now, Jesus obviously saw the restoring act of healing of this man an act of mercy that was very appropriate for the Sabbath day. In fact, he often did his healing specifically on the Sabbath day. I've got a list up here, I think on the next slide, of all the different times that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day. In Matthew 12, this situation where the man has a shriveled hand. The man with the unclean spirit in the synagogue in Mark 1. The woman who's crippled for 18 years in Luke 13. The next chapter, in chapter 14, the man with dropsy on the Sabbath day. The man at the pool of Bethesda who's crippled and unable to walk, paralyzed man, John 5. The blind man on John chapter 9. You wonder, why did all these healings be recorded specifically as happening on the Sabbath day? Because mercy, restoration, things like that are the purpose of the day. Jesus is fulfilling the law. Now, that's something for us to consider as we make application for our use of the Sabbath day. How are we doing the Lord's Day? What do we do with it? Certainly acts of mercy fit that very well to our use. What we're doing with the day rather than what we're avoiding on the day. And again, if you're teaching your children, think of that. I often think sometimes in the negative. Don't do this, don't do that. Be sure you're not playing in this game with these people in that situation. You see what I mean? It can all be negative. What we want to do is teach our children the purpose of the day. Okay? And that's what we're going to get to more as we go along. Jesus actually does the miracle of healing. He gives the teachers of the law a chance to answer the question correctly. That's what a teacher does. Ask the question, wait for the good answer. What is it lawful to do on the Sabbath day? To do good or to do evil? To save life or destroy it? And like happens in the classroom very often, dead silence. Why dead silence? Because it's obvious. You can't say to do evil. That doesn't even make sense, right? Of course it makes sense to do good rather than evil in this situation. And Jesus looks around, waits for the answer, but it's too obvious, no one will speak. And what he's doing is revealing an aspect of the true purpose of the absolute law that's been given by God. What are the purposes of the day? Well, rest is clearly one of those from the creation. Rest is the fundamental reason for the day, right? And then obviously a relationship, a communing with God on that day. In worship, the day is to be used for mercy, for healing, done to others. Now, not only had the Pharisees missed the purpose of the Sabbath, Their own laws that they had put in place, their own fences so that you wouldn't break the Sabbath, were keeping people from observing those true purposes. Their own law was obscuring the fact that Jesus, the Son of God, the Lord's anointed, was in their midst. Jesus, the lawgiver, exposes these men and their twisted philosophy of life. As one writer put it, they set a higher value on the harsh, hair-splitting rules than on God's law of love. They were more concerned about their traditions than about the health and happiness of a tragically handicapped individual. I think that's a temptation in every generation, to become those who love our hair-splitting rules and miss God's purposeful law. It's a temptation. Well, what does the passage say to us? Certainly one of the most practical lessons is that we ought to be cautious about that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be, again, someone who erases God's line, his wall, where he puts up a wall. To go beyond the wall is disobedience. Believers are all about trying to walk within the wall. They want to be careful about that. But I want us to be really, really sensitive about where we put our fences. Where we put our fences. Certainly that's what we're about here, is not articulating a rule that's not in God's Word. Again, maybe even if it's for zealous purposes, but then holding other people accountable to our fence, our rule. Okay? Now, I want to make this as practical as I can. I'm going to be a little controversial, but I'm doing it because this shows what I'm trying to say. As I was searching my mind for the best example of how we can do this, I couldn't help but something that I've seen repeatedly throughout my pastorate, throughout my childhood, as growing up in the church. I see this over and over again. And I want to say up front that the reason people put these fences in place, honestly, are often because they want to be careful. They want to walk within the boundaries. But what I'm using as this example demonstrates a couple of the aspects of what we're talking about. Here's one of those aspects. One of is that the rules people have set in place are done out of a sincere desire to avoid what God forbids. I don't want to go beyond the wall. They have set up a fence to assure that they won't come close to doing so. That seems like a really good thing. We want to acknowledge God's holiness, let's not break his law. But that sincere desire has not always taken into consideration if the fences that we set up uphold the purpose of the law initially. The love of God, the love of our neighbor. Okay? Third, this zeal too often grows into a conviction that the rule should be applied not just in my circumstances, but I'm now going to think of other people and whether they're breaking the commandment of God according to what they're doing with my fence. Okay? You understand what I'm saying there? That obedience is no longer obedience here, it's obedience where I've put the fence. And then when the fence is put up and applied in the church, what actually happens is that it often cripples the church from functioning as God designed. It robs people of freedoms. It also keeps them from serving as they were intended to serve. Now, what's my controversial rule, my example that I'm using? It's the place where the church over many generations has set up fences with regard to women in the church and what they may do. We all know that the passage in 1 Timothy 2:12 exists, right? We can't ignore the reality of the passage. It says this, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Amen. There's the statement of God's rule there. And I don't intend to go into great interpretations tonight of all that may mean, right? But I want to show that it's a passage that takes a great deal of careful discernment and study for how we apply it. But mostly what I want us to see tonight is that when you have a controversial issue like that and how you're trying to interpret a passage, it lends itself very, very naturally to these extremes of setting up fences where they do not belong. Okay? Fences where we overstep the boundary that God has articulated. And that might be okay until we realize that we're beginning to apply that fence to other people in the church and where those are happening. Okay? It might be okay. If we did that, we would already be in violation of God's overstepping God's boundary. God says here, we've placed the boundary here. we're in danger when we do that, obscuring the purpose of those boundaries that he does give. And then we are missing often something. We miss the principle of love for him and for our neighbor that we should put into place. Now consider what fences have been built over the years with regard to this particular topic. We could have an open discussion. That would be really interesting. But I've written down a couple of them that I've seen and observed over the years. These are, again, often put in place because we're trying to be careful not to break that commandment. And again, we're not intended by these who apply them to harm, but look actually what happens when we do this. And I'm going to divide them into two categories. These are maybe understandable fences that we build because we're so careful, we're trying to be careful to apply it right. And then there are some that are just less understandable. We just don't understand it, but we do it anyway. Let's start off with the ones that are maybe understandable. And we know in our own denomination we have some concerns that we're not allowing a woman to be a manager, maybe, or a deacon. That's a debate that's been around for a long, long time. And again, I'm not trying to settle it for us. But when we talk about authority, we have to be really careful what we're talking about under those circumstances. And we will often set up fences trying to avoid that issue of authority. That's one issue. Maybe another understandable fence that we build is that some people will refuse a woman to teach in any kind of form if there's a man present in the room. Okay? The idea would be if a woman is teaching, even if she is under the authority of a session that is overseeing her work, we're afraid to let her teach if that gives the impression maybe that she's going to have authority over these men. And we have to be, again, is that what God said? Is that the commandment? So those are maybe understandable rules that people might put in place. But let's think about some of the ones that don't even make a lot of sense in my sense. Some churches often as an unspoken rule, and that's often sad. We don't have a reason why we're doing it. We just do it over and over and over again. It's an unwritten rule, if you will. And that is that we will never let a woman do certain things in the church. Maybe I've seen these things where you don't allow a woman to take up the offering. You don't allow a woman to read the scriptures out loud in front of men. You don't let them lead the singing because that might be an authoritative demonstration. You may not let them lead in any kind of ministry in the church that's an open public ministry, or even pray aloud. I have heard that one over and over again. The woman is not allowed to pray out loud in the service when there's a gathering of believers. So these are some of these rules that I say I'm not quite sure if I understand the whole reason behind it. Maybe there's even one more. I had another in mind, but I heard this morning, for example, just on one of the social media kinds of things, that some churches are suggesting that women ought not to vote because that would be a demonstration of some kind of authority over society. So those are just some examples. Again, take the original rule, but we're beginning to draw fences that are larger and larger and larger fences. Now, note carefully what's happening when we do that. God sets his fence, and then we're fearful of stepping past the fence, so we build our own fences, and the gap between those two, I've got this demonstration up here, I hope you can see it on the illustration, is that the gap between where we put our fence and where God's wall was is where we begin to lose actual freedoms because we act out of fear. What we don't realize is that when we're putting that, we are robbing of freedom that God intended. Okay? So when we develop traditions that are not necessarily bad as long as they can correspond directly to God's revealed word, and further the purpose of loving God, our Heavenly Father, with all our hearts and so on, and our neighbor as ourselves. But the church misses out on the gifts, abilities, insights, sometimes of women because we're afraid to do that. We're afraid we're going to break the rule. We must not get caught up in the technicalities of law to the point that we miss God's intended purpose for what we're doing. Now, I think one of the things we clearly understand is that we understand that to take away from what God has commanded that's a sin. But do we realize also that to add to it is also a sin? To add what God's law has not said, that is a restriction that is also not placed over us. That's a sin as well. It's very easy to do, and we do it too often. So let's return as we close to the example of the keeping of the Sabbath day. Okay, what we're speaking about is easy to do as we attempt to obey a command to keep the Sabbath day in a society that has no idea what the fourth commandment was all about. Right? You think about where we are in our society with regard to the Sabbath day. There is absolutely no understanding in our common picture of that. But it would do us really well when we're thinking about how to apply this in our society to distinguish between what God said about the law and our fences that we have built that are subjective. Now, the evident principle established by Scripture with regard to that commandment, it seems, is to make that day a day of rest. I think sometimes the church is so busy it gets lost even in our busyness that we can't rest on the Sabbath day. But it's also clearly something where we want to have that communion with God, a day of refreshment, not just physically, but spiritually, a time when we meet and commune with God in worship. God says that we're to lay aside our work, maybe our commerce, if you will, in order to take up those works of necessity, the things that are acts of mercy, those kinds of acts. We may decide on a specific way that we're personally going to apply that, and you have to, right? You have to have some way that you're going to walk in obedience, but to expect others to follow always those fences that you put in place, we have to be careful about that. Maybe it's not good. In fact, it could be harmful. Maybe a good principle is to hold very tightly to the commandment of God and loosely to our applications of it. We have to allow other people, other believers, to wrestle with God in His commands, in how they walk obediently. Be faithful to give them the room to do that. That doesn't mean we can't suggest that, I'm concerned that it seems like your application isn't in line with the original commandment. That's okay. But again, we're doing it with grace because we realize the distinction between my rules and His rules. Now, in Mark's parallel account, he adds that Jesus not only called Himself the Lord of the Sabbath, but he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Lord's Day was not designed to become cumbersome or an imposition to man. We were created before the Sabbath day was instituted with the purpose of serving and honoring our Maker, right? And so the law of the Sabbath was God's creating and giving a commandment on how we can do that the best way. Here's my commandment to help you do that, so that you use the day for your benefit, for the day being for you, that it will be to bless you, to do that for which you were created. So the day was set aside for our building up, not our tearing down. It was not set aside so that we could get done all the things from the rest of the week that we didn't have time for. Okay? That is not what it's for. Some things should be done, must be done. Works of necessity, we say. What are those? Well, again, we have to have good discussions about that if we're trying to help one another walk faithfully. Things that can't be delayed without causing harm or danger to somebody or harm. Jesus demonstrates that one of the things that could clearly be done on that day was to heal the sick, to be about that work of caring for people who are sick or injured. Now, we might add to that providing basic needs. If someone needs water, food, care, shelter, those kinds of things. Protecting life, property from immediate threats. We want to ensure services that are deemed absolutely essential. Now, you can debate that, and so we have to be careful about how we come to conclude that. But think about what is essential. There will have to be wisdom applied in how you make those decisions, and grace be given to others who in good conscience have made decisions other than yours. Regardless, we want to look for the underlying purpose. What's God doing in the law? Is loving Him and loving our neighbor. To our works of necessity, we want to add those works of mercy. What are acts of mercy? Well, they're motivated by a care to relieve suffering, to show compassion, relieve distress. It's a good use of the day. Well, as you analyze your use of the Lord's Day, for example, ask yourself if you're being fit. Is your body being fit? Is your soul being fit for the service of the kingdom? At the end of the Lord's Day, are you better off than you were before the day? Are you rested? Are you refreshed? Are you spiritually built up? Are others, because of your interaction with them, built up in that way? Well, the Sabbath day is just one of all of the commandments of God, right? So this takes a lot of work, a lot of discernment, a lot of care. It's one of many laws that are recorded for our good. It's always good to remember that God gives us His law for our benefit. Let's be careful to clarify the distinction between man-made applications and God's original law, and then look for his good design in giving it. Let's labor to understand how I can love him more with my whole soul, strength, mind, and also love my neighbor. And then let's demonstrate grace with one another as together we're carefully trying to walk obediently to God's law. Okay? Let's pray.